Hello, welcome to our online discussion on recent protests in Russia, where we are going to discuss also the prospects for Putin's regime and pro-democracy movement and the position of Europe on Russia. I'm Natalia Arnold, President of Free Russia Foundation. And on behalf of all of us, let me thank the organizers of today's event, the Wilfred Martens Centre for European Studies, the official think tank of the European People's Party, for such a great idea, this timely discussion with the most prominent speakers possible. We are going to discuss the latest developments in Russia, the biggest nationwide confrontation in years between the Kremlin and its opponent, when tens of thousands of Russians went out to the streets in all 11 time zones throughout the entire country, of all ages, to take part in the biggest sanctions rallies since 1991. The protesters were met with the harshest force by the police ever. And they were demanding the release of the imprisoned Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who was immediately detained upon his arrival to return to Russia from Germany, where he was recovering a near-fatal poisoning with the military-grade state-produced Novichok. Of course, the protests were bigger than Navalny's wrongful imprisonment or his video expose of a $1.3 billion Putin's palace, or Rottenberg's palace, and which was watched by over 113 million viewers, Russians and global audiences. We have fatigue with Putin in the Russian society, which is difficult to silence with just a sham plebiscite or a brutal crackdown by the police. So let me introduce our distinguished speakers today. So we'll have the Honorable Carl Bildt, board member of our host organization, the Martens Centre, and co-chair of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Also a former Prime Minister and former Foreign Minister of Sweden. He was member of Swedish Parliament and leader of the center-right moderate party. It's also my honor to introduce the Honorable Mikuláš Dzurinda, the president of the Martens Centre. He was former Prime Minister of Slovakia, also Minister of Transportation, Minister of Foreign Affairs, a founding member and a chairman of the Slovak Democratic and Christian Union Democratic Party. And it's my pleasure to introduce Vladimir Milov, a Russian opposition politician, economist, energy specialist, popular YouTuber, former Deputy Minister of Energy, and undoubtedly a future Prime Minister or Foreign Minister of a free and democratic Russia. So let me also remind everybody that our event is being live streamed on Facebook. So please ask your questions. We have a lot of time, I hope, for your questions. The hashtags of our event is hashtag Hello again. Apologies for this technical difficulty. We are back. So we are going to start with Vladimir Milov. And Vladimir, please give us a brief overview of what's going on in Russia at the moment. How would you assess the significance of protests, and where do you see the things going between now and, let's say, parliamentary elections, maybe further? What are some plausible worst-case scenarios for the West in the near future, and how to avoid them? And also, as for Russian people, is it going to be the darkest before the dawn? The floor is yours, Vladimir.
Yeah, thank you very much. First, it's a privilege to be part of such a timely discussion on such a distinguished company. And I also wanted to begin by congratulating our moderator, Natalia Arnaud, wishing her a happy birthday. She has a birthday today. And Natalia, thanks for all that you are doing. You are a real defender of the motherland, unlike all this masked people in uniforms with hidden identity who grab foreign lands, as I just said to you before. Now, first, speaking of what's happening here in Russia, yes, it is as bad as it looks from the outside, and probably even worse. Because point number one, we have never seen such an extent of a crackdown on a peaceful protests. And believe me, I lived in the Brezhnev times, in Andropov times. There was nothing like that during just like little over than 10 days of Navalny's protests on the streets of Moscow in late January, early February. More than 11,000 people have been detained across the country. There's been brutal beatings. I think one important feature which distinguishing the present moment is this total lawlessness. Like lawyers are not allowed into police stations to talk to people who have been detained. Many homes being raided with lawyers also kept outside. Nobody has any idea what's going on inside. So one specific feature which we did not see before to that extent was like this absolute, total, and I would say demonstrative disregard for the law. It's also pretty damaging in the wake of upcoming parliamentary elections, which I think it's pretty clear to everybody that it's all connected. We have a very decisive parliamentary election coming in September, where according even to the official polls by very loyal pro-Kremlin pollsters, I tweeted some of those yesterday in replies to announcements of today's event. Putin and his party, United Russia, is doing historically badly. They're at historically low levels and continuing to plunge. The events of January, February had a very negative and sharp impact. Putin's popularity, according to like very loyal pro-Kremlin pollster FOM, had plunged by 6 points just within 4 weeks. That's pretty unprecedented. It's comparable to the COVID economic crisis, and it was clearly related to Navalny's Palace movie and Navalny's arrest upon his return. So obviously the authorities are very afraid of what's coming up in September. They are really on the brink of losing the parliamentary majority for the first time since 2003. And it was exactly that parliamentary majority which effectively enabled Putin to do a full-scale constitutional power grab, giving him the absolute power that he enjoyed for during most of his tenure. So we are in a very unfortunate situation when most of the infrastructure of the opposition has been largely smashed during this recent crackdown. Many prominent figures are either under arrest or were forced to emigrate. I'm one of the few who are still free, but it's not over yet. If you hear a knock on the door while we're speaking here, that's probably it, because all the pizzas that we ordered has been already delivered. So that's a pretty tough atmosphere in here. You must understand one thing: we cannot talk about a normal election campaign in such a circumstance, in such an environment. That tyranny has to be stopped. The repression has to be ended. If it is not ended, then we cannot talk about even remotely free and fair elections that are scheduled for September. It's clearly that Putin wants it to be Lukashenka style, but it's also very important for the free peoples of the democratic world to understand that in such a repressive atmosphere, this will not be election. It will be something else. And a very important point about Western reaction, particularly European reaction, and what the West can do in this situation. Now, you can just take a look at replies at my recent posts in social media to see that our supporters, the opposition supporters, are, not to understate it, extremely disappointed with very limited action that Europe has taken so far as a response to what Russian government is doing to Navalny, to the crackdown on democratic protests. It's not just, I mean, we're not like talking about some specific actions right here. We're talking about a show of solidarity, because people who have democratic aspirations in Russia, they really hope that democratic cross-border solidarity with all the free peoples of the democratic world, these are not just empty words. And values are more important than commercial ties with Putin's regime. So unfortunately, again, let me put it mildly, we did not see much of the action on the side of Europe, United States so far, reacting to, again, I would stress, unprecedented brutality and a total disregard for the law, unseen in decades, unseen in decades. Again, we're probably outpassing Brezhnev and Andropov times by certain criteria with the recent crackdown. So I'll be happy to discuss this in more detail. I know how complicated it is to reach a consensus in Europe, also to follow the rule of law in imposing sanctions. It's a tough process. You don't have to explain me, I know. But we need, I mean, I'm just translating not my personal opinion, but like many thousands of my followers who've been reaching out to me in the recent days, saying that we need to see more action on the European side in response to Putin's tyranny. And I'll finish with quoting, I just tweeted a very nice picture posted out by European People's Party group in the European People Parliament, who say, hit Putin where it hurts, money. This is what we have been talking about for ages, that Putin's oligarchy likes to keep their money in the West, particularly in Europe, bribe European officials, politicians, business, and so on. That has to be stopped, and I think it's time to act. I'll stop here and would love to hear what my dear friends and colleagues have to say.
Thank you so much, Vladimir. Thank you, very valuable input. Mr. Bild, for the entire period of Putin's rule, let's be honest, Europe, the West, has been appeasing Putin, despite his increasing domestic repressions or global escapades. But what Vladimir just explained, all this situation with Navalny, Novichok arrest, brutal crackdown by the police of protesters when they were denied basic rights, as Vladimir put it, total lawlessness, all this increasing amount of draconian laws. Isn't it a turning point? Isn't it enough? Putin is threatening the EU with cut-off ties, and as we heard, Mr. Lavrov said it's Europe's fault. Clearly, Putin continues to talk with the West with the language of power and continues showing his muscles to the West. Is Europe going to yield to him? Is it possible to respond to Putin with one voice or with also many different national interests? It's impossible. And also, is there a united transatlantic front on that? Thank you.
Thank you, and a pleasure to be with you, particularly to see that Vladimir is still with us. We hope that the door will stay quiet for a prolonged period of time, I have to say. I think that you are right in pointing out this is a critical period. I think we are at the watershed period. Vladimir Putin has been in power in the Kremlin for 21 years, nearly. It's a long time. Things have been changing gradually during that period. It's not been uniform, neither the Russian policy nor the Western response to it. I was around in periods where we were still harboring beliefs and dreams of being able to cooperate much more closely with a Russia that is still a great and important European nation. But clearly we are now in a different situation. This particular situation, the acute one, started with the absolutely extraordinary event of the attempt to murder Alexei Navalny. They've been trying to put him to prison and all sorts of things for a prolonged period of time. No question about that. He's not a favorite of the Kremlin, mildly speaking, but it was still something that went beyond, I think, what nearly everyone expected. I don't know about Vladimir, but clearly among Russia watchers in the West, to use that particular phrase, this was extraordinary. Why was that done? Then, luckily, they failed with it, and everything we've seen from then, Alexei surviving in Germany, coming back, the film, the demonstrations, and whatever follows from that. I think we are in a situation where I said Vladimir Putin has been there for 21 years, but we are in the final phase of that regime. We don't know exactly when it's going to end. We don't know how it's going to end. We're somewhat uncertain. Everyone is uncertain what's going to come after. But I think there's a great nervousness. That's the only explanation I have for what's happening. A great nervousness in the structures of power around the Kremlin. And the poisoning or the attempt to murder Alexei can only be explained in that perspective, as can we explain as Vladimir pointed out, the extraordinary brutality in the attempt to clamp down on the opposition in the street. I do think as well, although I haven't been to Russia for last year, there's an increase in uncertainty inside these particular structures of power as well. We see what's happening on the streets, but what is happening inside the structures is perhaps as important. The nervousness, what's going to happen with the end of the Putin regime, and with sort of the corruption and the power structures and whatever. So what can Europe do? Well, first we have to be able to counter the policies of the Kremlin in different respects. We've seen the increasingly authoritarian policies. We've seen the increasingly revisionist policies, Ukraine, other places. We've seen the increasingly confrontational policies towards the West. But Russia is a weak power in these days. I think the bluster and the sort of the language that is used really demonstrates the weakness of the Russian regime and the weakness of its positions. I mean, we Europe can look back. If he wants to break off relations, I mean, our trade with Russia is fairly limited. But Russia's trade with Europe is massive. And Europe is dependent upon investments. And Europe as a market is massive. So Russia's dependent on the EU is massive. EU is dependent on Russia is, even when you took at the gas, fairly marginal, if you look at it. So the regime is in a fairly weak position. Measures were now taken, or decided not taken yet, but decided by the foreign affairs ministers yesterday. Vladimir will say it was too little. I think we can agree with that. But be aware of the fact, and I think you are aware of the fact, that there have been different voices on Russia in Europe. And go back a couple of weeks, and the decision that was taken yesterday was not going to be possible. I think when Josep Borrell went to Moscow, as a matter of fact, he said that sanctions were not on the table. And suddenly sanctions are on the table. And it was taken, that decision was taken fairly fast, I understand, and unanimous, which is fairly, having been around that table, Nicholas and I have both been in, we know that was not taken for granted. Then, of course, it's going to have effects on the overall approach to Russia on quite a number of different issues. We now only talk sanctions, but you will see a new attitude coming towards looking at money flows that was alluded to. And I think we'll see here an increased coordination and dialogue across the Atlantic. The US has certain instruments available that the European Union doesn't have. But I think you'll see an increasing attention to that. You'll see increasing attention, I think, also to helping to, say, Ukraine, which needs really the support in order to block the attempts that are there, in order to make clear to Russia that, well, we are in favor of a democratic, normal Russia, but we are not in favor of a revisionist Russia. So I think you will see when you look back, I think we will see what's been happening during the last few weeks as a turning point in the attitude and the relationship between the European Union and Russia. It will not be a break of relations. There will be a need for dialogue on a number of diplomatic issues. But that's another. But it's going to be a different relationship. And I think the extraordinary stupidity and outrage of trying to murder Alexei Navalny is really going to be the thing that has changed the equation.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bildt. Mr. Dzurinda, my next question is to you. And I have to ask you about the recent visit of High Representative Joseph Borrell to Moscow. Let's be honest again, quite disastrous visit. And we see an impressive anger at the situation at the European Parliament when all key factions, except far right and far left, demand for a stronger response to Putin. And we know that there are already very strong European Parliament resolutions on that, and they are quite in line with what Navalny's team is proposing. But what about the real action? As we discussed this yesterday's meeting of foreign ministers, and as Mr. Bildt and Vladimir diplomatically said, too little, I would say it's quite a neutered list of officials offered for the sanctions. So what about the real actions? What forces in the EU are sabotaging the real response to Putin, and what can change that? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natasha. I would like to join Vladimir and congratulate you because today is a very special one for you. Happy birthday.
Thank you.
The second, I am really pleased that Karel and Vladimir have accepted our invitation to discuss these hottest issues on the platform of the Wilfried Martens Centre for European Studies. And now to the point. Well, at the beginning, I'd like to tell you that I have pretty high level of understanding of what is going on in Russia, because I have my personal twofold experience with dictatorship. The first, it was time of communism, and the second time of my predecessor in the office, Mr. Mečiar. Karel must remember, because you had been serving at the same time with Vladimir Mečiar. Long story short, a man like Donald Trump be. So it was very difficult. Thanks also to international solidarity, at the end of the day, we have survived. So this is why I have full understanding also for your question. Having had some experience also as a foreign minister, I realized how difficult it is to adopt sanctions unanimously, because you know that in the EU, in foreign policy defense, unanimity is needed also in some other issues. So I'm thinking every day in these times what international community should do. Speaking about Russia of these days, I believe that we should think the issue in a wider, it means geopolitical context. The first has been indicated by you, Natalia. EU is losing gradually, slowly but surely, authority. Our authority is waning. It was really epitomized in the case of Joseph Borrell in Moscow. It was very, very bad and sad picture also for me, I have to admit. So we should be aware of that. If you lose authority, if you are losing respect towards you, you face huge consequences. This is the first, I would say, a line of my thinking. But there is also the second demarcation line when speaking geopolitical frame of the event. This is the United States. We got used for many, many decades that the US will help if needed and is at our disposal all the time. Joe Biden is fantastic news also for Europe. But today we should realize that it is us, Europeans, who are expected to help and contribute, not the other way around. So, making long story short, given my own experience, agreeing with Karol that this is a real turning point in EU-Russia relations, I would only add that there is something like expectations on the Russian side, on the side of the democratic opposition and freedom fighters. And we should meet these expectations. This is why, and I will be very frank, because otherwise it has no sense, I think more and more that our action should be really bold, maybe for some people crazy, but very bold and tangible. I aim at Nord Stream 2 project, being very, very frank. I realize that without Germany, it is impossible because this is a bilateral, economic, but also geopolitical issue. So without Germany, it is impossible. So Karol knows about my idea, and I will deliver this idea also at the next EPP Presidium meeting. Maybe this is a bit crazy, but I'm a thinker in these days. I must be crazy a bit. So maybe it is possible, it would be possible to organize a coalition of willing who would help Germany to adopt such difficult, unprecedented, I would say, decision. I realized that the project is very costly. I realized that only a few miles is needed to conclude the project. But I believe that in case of our European solidarity with the contribution of the United States, it would be possible to compensate to a large extent these losses. And I'm speaking just about potential possibility to enforce Putin, to reduce this strange pressure on freedom fighters in Russia, as Vladimir spoke about, so I would say concretely and also with some level of emotions. So maybe this way could be followed or taken into account. Otherwise, I don't believe that Putin will take our reaction solidarity, even though I agree with all those who are calling for personal restrictions as well. It is painful, it is welcomed. I am also happy that yesterday foreign ministers have decided something, but at the same time, I understand a lot that these measures should be followed or should follow with some more tangible, more concrete sanctions of economic nature. And this is why I picked up this very, for Putin regime, for the Kremlin sensitive project as the pipeline Nord Stream 2.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dzuriba. You actually anticipated the question, this question by your colleague Roland Freudenstein, who asked that I believe Nord Stream 2 is probably the biggest geopolitical mistake by the German government of the past decade. It splits the EU, supports Kremlin corruption, and weakens democracies such as Ukraine. Can it still be stopped? So maybe since you already talked about that, I also will ask Vladimir Milov about Nord Stream 2, and why do you think Europe is not using this Nord Stream 2, canceling Nord Stream 2 as a stronger leverage against Putin to moderate his recent behavior? And since you will be responding and we don't have much time, just another question from Elena Sergeyeva, our listener. So how do you and the Anti-Corruption Foundation react to this news regarding the EU sanctions against Kremlin? As the rumor says that only a few people from Navalny list will be sanctioned. Is it disappointing? Is there anything else to do to force the whole list to be considered? Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. First, on Nord Stream, I think generally the word which characterizes everything is that the EU in general and Germany in particular have simply overslept this project. because Putin have simply outsmarted people. He pursued this project, he didn't come and say, look, I have this big geopolitical weapon, I'm going to be bashing it on you. No, he didn't do it like that. He perceived it as like a, small size, just another commercial project done by companies, creating ties with local community. Like one of the biggest allies, obviously, in Europe and in Germany is the government of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, which basically enjoys some new jobs being created because of Nord Stream 2, and so that's explainable. So Putin had managed to create this very successful network of supporters, making it dressed up as a purely commercial project, and many people in Europe have simply overslept this threat coming in, which is why the reaction is too little too late, because the damage has been already done. I think this goes back to generally reassessing the relations with Putin, because in European discussion these days, we see it like, oh, there's this big problem country, Russia, with rogue regime, we need to do something about it. Listen, it's not just a country out there somewhere in the northeast. First, it's part of a very strong cartel of dictatorships, including China, Iranians, Bashar Assad, Lukashenka, anybody else who want to take on and attack the liberal democratic order. So it's not just a private Russia issue that we're discussing here. Russia is part of the bigger problem. And second, if the past 20 years of Putin have taught us something, it's that Putin's lawlessness and brutality and aggression doesn't end up at home with using it against Russian opposition. Next step, it will be exporting it, which it has always done, and attacking other countries, poisoning people, European citizens at a European soil. So the Novichok thing is, yes, it's mostly used against Russian oppositioners, but not only. And where is the guarantee that he will not use it tomorrow against his European counterparts? So I think the look at Russia should be bigger than Putin wants Europeans to have pursuing his efforts, projects, aggressive moves, interference, and so on. You need to really calibrate that stuff. And on a recent decision, I would agree with Carl Bildt, because I'm a little bit more advanced person who knows the inside of how these decisions are made. I understand how difficult it is, given that EU has 27 member countries with different opinions, politicians who have to respond to their constituencies, who have jobs dependent on relations with Russia, local self-governance. Again, we come back to Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, which is very dependent on development on Nord Stream 2 and so on. I'll know how complicated it is. So I just said in my remarks that yesterday's decision was better than nothing. But it's not nearly enough to be a watermark, to show that Europe has realized that something really serious is going here, which is important not only for the Democrats and democratic forces in Russia, but for the rest of Europe and for the rest of the world. So yesterday's decision is a move in the right direction. There is still a way to go. I see that there are good forces in Europe which understand the threat. Again, coming back to EPP groups phrase, hit Putin where it hurts, money. So there is still hope. I hope that my European friends will sort of get on the right track. They're halfway there, and I'm here to just fully support and assist this process all the way I can.
Thank you, Vladimir. Mr. Bildt, as Sweden's former foreign minister, you were in office during a number of milestones in recent Russian history, including the annexation of Crimea. But now, is it the biggest confrontation between the West and the Kremlin? How would you describe the evolution, or maybe the opposite of evolution, the regression of Russian foreign policy? The strategy, tactics, the competence of its personnel throughout this past 2 decades. Have you seen any dramatic shifts lately? And also, what surprised you in Russian foreign policies, if any? Thank you.
Well, I've been surprised by lately the very confrontational tone that has been taken by Sergei Lavrov. He's done it before at different occasions. He is certainly capable of that. He's capable of a lot of different things. But I've also been through periods where we've had a fairly constructive relationship with Russia in spite of disagreements. Diplomacy is the art of handling disagreements in a constructive way. But Russia has gone very confrontational in its language and its attitude to primarily the European Union. And I interpret that as sort of aggressive defensive from a nervous position. If you don't have anything else to do, you can sort of be aggressive in your diplomacy in the way they've been doing. Also the Twitter feeds and the spokesperson of the Med is fairly extraordinary. I mean, it is not building friends. Even if their strategy, I understand, is to isolate the European Union and try to build links with individual EU member countries. That's the strategy at the moment. But what they are doing now is counterproductive. I mean, distinctly counterproductive. And I explained that out of the more sort of defensive position that they have. On what to be done, because I think we all need to do some thinking. I'm not convinced that the Putin regime stands and falls with Nord Stream 2. I would focus on two things. I would focus on illicit money flows of different sorts. Definition of illicit can become somewhat complicated, but clearly this is something that has not been that much in focus of Western policy making in the previous years. We saw in the extraordinary film on Putin's palace quite a number of different names. Some of them are on sanctions already in that particular corrupt circle, but not everyone is. And to start to target their money flows of different sorts, that we need to do together with Americans, because they say they have instruments that we don't have due to this position of the dollar. The second thing I would do is to look at the digital situation. I've been sort of very much surprised by the fact that sort of Vladimir and others are YouTube stars. And I'm quite certain that the Kremlin have been trying to close that down X numbers of times. It's not been possible. They have been trying to limit other digital access in Russia, which they've also failed with. They are trying as much as they can. We need to look at the ways in which we can counter that and make certain that there is as much access as is possible for a free information flow. Because a lot of what I see going on in Russia today is a battle between what we call the television generation, those that the Kremlin reaches with the television, which is still a very powerful political instrument that they control, and the internet and the YouTube generation, which Vladimir and Alexei and others are reaching. And whatever we can do to make certain that that particular avenue for information, for debate, for dialogue, whatever we can do to keep that open, I think is going to be long-term, extremely strategic. So the illicit money flows in the West and the digital access in Russia itself are sort of two critical issues where I would devote some thinking to on what more concretely we could do, although some of the thoughts are perhaps not appropriate for public discussion.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Bildt. Mr. Dzurinda, perhaps the same questions to you. What do you think about Putin's foreign policy? But also, you have, and you mentioned you have some hands-on experience with pushing autocrats out of the office. So what would you be advising to Russian pro-democracy movement on that? Thank you. Please unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's very difficult because on one side, Karel is right that nervosity is evident, nervosity coming from Kremlin. On the other side, look at the region, look at the Middle East, look at the issue related to Nagorno-Karabakh. Look at the countries of Eastern Partnership, look at the Western Balkans. So Russia, we should admit, Russia of the last years have been pretty successful in disturbing, in prevailing with its interests to a large extent. So my understanding is a bit mixed. Weakness, nervosity on one side, a huge public movement. On the other side, it must be for Putin and the regime really horrible. You know, I got used for many years the slogan that, do you know what is the difference between Ukraine and Russia? Ukraine has a vibrant civic society, but very weak governance. In Russia, the other way around. This is not the case anymore. I am so glad that there is an eruption of civic society in Russia. So for Putin, it must be a nightmare. And this is great. But on the other side, the regime is very capable, still very dangerous. So I tend to say that there are two possibilities of the further development. The first is even greater pressure of the regime, the shift from the autocratic regime to real dictatorship, or gradual release towards plurality. The latter would be better, but who knows in these days how Putin thinks and how will he act. I have a lot of experience with him, a lot of experience. I was at the debate between Putin and Bush in Bratislava in February. Yeah, it was in February 2005. You would never said how emotional the guy can be, and not pleasant, I would say sometimes. If the interest of him is running against your interest, you are not in a good position. So by my mind, we should do everything in our power to help freedom fighters, to try to send a clear message to Moscow that we are not against Russia, but we are for plurality. We should not try to export our liberal democracy system, but we have the right to talk about universal values, about the rule of law, about human dignity, about human rights, and at the end of the day, about plurality, which is much better and perspective than dictatorship or tyranny.
Yes, thank you so much. And we have the further question on support to Russian democracy and on a clear distinction between the Kremlin and Russia, Russia of the future. It's a great question from our colleague Barbara von Freitag of the Martens Centre, and her question is probably to Mr. Bild. How it's possible to revive, reframe, revitalize the EU so-called fifth principle and develop it into a proper and visible policy of support and solidarity for those Russians who still see Europe as a partner? Thank you.
I think it's important to look at different ways in which we can sort of increase the possibilities of people-to-people contacts and keep all of those channels open. It's not entirely easy. Because as Vladimir knows, I mean, people who are in contact with NGOs or whatever, they can easily be labeled foreign agents and all sorts of measures taken in order to restrict that. But we should not give up. That sort of developing those networks and those contacts are very, very important. And then I think it is very important to send the message that our door is really open to Russia. We really want Russia to be part of Europe. We see Russia as a great European nation. It belongs to the family long term. And when change happens in Russia, we will be jubilant. Because it is, of course, part of the propaganda of the regime to say that we are anti-Russian or whatever they say, which is first not true. But secondly, very important that we take that into account, to develop the policies, and try to develop all of the instruments of that sort of contact that we can. But the room has narrowed down. I've seen that during the last, say, 10 years, how it has been more difficult. But the fact that it's more difficult is perhaps a good reason for us to try even more.
Thank you so much. Vladimir, in all our fairy tales, Russian legends, we have this saying about the villain's death is in a needle is an egg is in a duck, and so on. So where is Putin's needle? And also speaking about that as an expert in Russian economy, can you provide us with this current state of Russian economy with all this poor performance, poor handling of pandemic, inefficient economic policies, or even absence of that, over 20 million of Russians living in poverty. How long the regime can survive all that?
Thank you. First advice is never to oversimplify things. So people are always looking for this one magic clue, the silver bullet, which you crack it and you sort of change things. No, it's all of the above policy that I think shall be taken into account. And Putin also, I agree with Carl Bildt, fundamentally agree that Putin's regime is very weak. Over 20 years, Putin did not build anything which can serve as a model to the rest of the world, what anyone would like to replicate, right? But it survives on maneuvering, using different types of bribery, propaganda, force here and there, sometimes in relatively small quantities, but being used in a smart way, this combined picture finally works and delivers him the result. So I think rather than looking for some simple instrument, how to find and break this needle, right? We need to understand the complexity. His survival is due to complexity of all the different means that he is using. And this is also now, because at the same time, while he is actually trying to crack down on protesters, they are also discussing in the government a new federal assistance package to the ordinary Russians ahead of the Duma elections to essentially bribe people to give them some small amounts of cash so they go and do it again, vote for the ruling party. I think this won't work this time, but you never need to underestimate him and his different forms of maneuvering and using different instrumentarium. Now, economy is pretty bad, and this was at the heart of his declining approval ratings. This was the foundation of his declining popularity in the past 7-10 years. Western sanctions have a great part to do with it, because don't believe those who say sanctions don't work. Oh, yes, they do, because Russian big businesses, state-controlled companies have essentially lost access to foreign credit. This was something that has driven our economic growth before 2014, before we attacked Ukraine. So sectoral sanctions really matter. If you remove sectoral sanctions, we'll have Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan bringing in billions immediately, and we'll have 7% annual GDP growth, and Putin's popularity will explode back to 80%. So sectoral sanctions matter, right? Economy really matters. But I would suggest, sorry for speaking so long, but I think it's an important point. I would suggest a roadmap how we move on in the next few months. I'm coming back to these Duma elections coming up in September. Make it simple. If Putin releases all political prisoners and allows free and fair electoral campaign so that the Russians decide what the next parliament will look like, then there might be a positive turn in the relations. If he cracks down, puts everyone in jail, and appoints United Russia supermajority again, then I think a no recognition policy should be applied. This should not be treated as parliament. These MPs, their diplomatic passports should not be recognized in Europe. They should not be recognized by members of parliament internationally. Yes, de facto Putin is a ruler, but this parliament will not be elected this way by real Russians, so we won't deal with it. I think here's the sensible alternative for Europe to approach. You are about to decide Russia policy next month in March at the European Council level. I think upcoming parliamentary elections should be put at the center.
Thank you, Vladimir. We have a great question from Bartolomei Kot. Question to Mr. Bildt. How to incorporate the Belarus question into a broader, coherent EU policy towards Russia? Is there space for the EU to facilitate cooperation between Russian and Belarusian Democrats as Lukashenko and Putin build their common front? Thank you.
I think cooperation between Russian and Belarusian Democrats are done best by themselves. I mean, these are two countries that are sort of essentially friendly with each other and have very good relationship on a people-to-people level. And we've seen that there's been an element of solidarity between the two democratic movements, if I phrase it like that. I don't think we should try to sort of interfere in that too much. Belarus is quite a challenge, no question about that, because Lukashenko has been using the impressive repressive machinery in a very brutal way. At the same time, I agree with Vladimir that the Russian economy is not in the best of shapes. But if you can compare it with the Belarus economy, the Russian economy is in a stellar position. With the Belarus economy is sort of a Soviet museum held up by Russian subsidies de facto, and it's not sustainable. So there will have the change will come in Belarus. That's for certain. And I guess people are very busy in the Kremlin trying to engineer some sort of stable Kremlin-friendly succession in Belarus. But the longer this goes on, I think the likelihood of them succeeding with that is going to decline. What we can do is to keep up the pressure on Belarus, obviously, without pressing Belarus completely into the arms of the Kremlin. It's a balancing act, as sometimes. But I think the strongest thing going on, I was impressed by what I saw on YouTube, as usual, with the demonstrations in Khabarovsk, which is Vladivostok even, far away. They were expressing solidarity with Belarus. And that solidarity, I think, is perhaps stronger than very many things that we can do in Brussels and Stockholm.
May I join, Karol, because he spoke, what can we do for Belarusian or for Russian freedom fighters? In summertime, we organized the visits of young Belarusians to Brussels to understand better what the EU is about, how to shape common future in Europe, and it was pretty successful. We made, if I'm not mistaken, a number of events for them, for young Belarusians. Maybe we will think in the Martens Centre how to combine such summer events also with young freedom fighters from Russia. It is possible.
Thank you so much. And 2 questions to Vladimir from our audience. So Max Astrom is asking, it's already clear that the problem of Russia will last for more than 1 year. Do you have a strategy? How and when do you want to defeat corruption in Russia? When will the ice really break? How do you imagine that? And also we have a question from Roland again, that I think it's very important to emphasize that Russia has a democratic future. The question is not if, but when. But what are the criteria for Russia that we can live and cooperate with? Vladimir, I'm not sure if he is here. Okay. I think Vladimir has a bad connection, so we'll address those questions to him again.
Thank you, Natasha. First,
go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
So it's my connection. Yeah, hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. First, I think we are right now in the process of reassessing the situation because it very rapidly spiraled to a crackdown, total crackdown on the protest movement, like a total clash between Putin and the opposition network, which has been built for years. We have been essentially preparing for, well, not exactly peaceful. We know where we are living and what government is in power in Russia, but we have been preparing for like a more or less stable, non-confrontational parliamentary campaign, which has very rapidly spiraled into poisonings, murder attempts, brutal arrests, total lawlessness, and so on. And many people ask us the question in this environment, what is the strategy? We do have some ideas how to go forward, but we need to reassess the damage first, because our strategy that is solely focused on Duma elections, it suffered a very serious blow at the moment. I think everybody understands that. So my suggestion is please be patient and don't ask us to come up with some very clear roadmaps on what to do tomorrow, the day after, on Friday, and so on, because we are under enormous pressure and we need to do a serious reassessment. But the historical trend is there. Like Carl Bildt said, this regime is entering its final stage. It's very clear. We see that in the polls. We saw that in the election voting. We see that in the mass protests that Russian people, many millions and millions of Russians have had enough with this regime. So there will be change. If you want a clear schedule as to when and how, I'm not sure I will be able to provide it right now. But you also saw during the recent protest rallies that this opposition movement is the strongest political movement in the country. Nobody else is capable of bringing so much people in onto the streets protesting, despite all the threats of physical violence that Putin has been constantly putting out. So we are on that difficult road. No specific schedule that I can offer so far, but believe me, we will not give up this fight.
Thank you so much. We don't have much time, but the host advised me that we can go a little bit over because it's really a very interesting discussion. So my probably last question to Mr. Dzyurinda. Your government in Slovakia was extolled for its success in shepherding some critical reforms. What do you think? Is Putin's government capable of reforms? And what are low-hanging fruits? Where can they start? Is it even possible? Thank you. Please unmute.
Thank you. Look, I realize that Russia is not Slovakia or Czechoslovakia, but on the other side, I'm pretty convinced that there are something like a universal approach how to restructure economy, how to promote reforms. By the way, with Martens Centre, we had been operating for years in Ukraine, sharing our experience from reforms. A lot of former prime ministers, defense ministers, finance ministers, a lot of experts visited not only Kiev, but also Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkiv, Lviv, many other cities. And I believe it was a success. So I strongly believe that Russia enjoys a number of experts and really real reformators, such as Vladimir, for instance. He has a lot of experience from economy, especially in the branch of energy. By the way, I remember also some positive times in recent Russia history. Yegor Gaidar, for instance, Boris Nemtsov. So I remember a period of time. Mikhail Kasyanov, by the way, prime minister. So I remember some episodes when Russia had been able to promote reforms. Now the need is back. Absolutely, I'm convinced that a strong generation of economists and reformers, such as Vladimir, will emerge if they are getting a chance to come and to promote. I believe in such a future. In this case, I would be much more than happy to contribute, to share our experience, because it was really something.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dzyurinda. And let's have some concluding remarks, a la Carl Bildt 60-second style. Let's start with Vladimir. Anything you haven't covered you want to address to your European counterparts?
I can agree with what
thank you so much. It was a great discussion, and we are in constant touch with our European colleagues. Again, I will have to say that we understand all the complexities, but look, Europe serves as a role model. Free democratic Europe serves as a role model for people with democratic aspirations in Russia who want to build a better Russia, more suitable for living. Based on your experience, Russian Democrats consider European Union a great success story in that regard, and we need your help. We can't do it alone, because if many Europeans, unfortunately, who are still doing that, we will continue to enable what Putin is allowing himself to do at home. that is unacceptable. That will only strengthen him. So we suggest that together we act to actually put this brutality, tyranny, and oppression to an end.
Thank you, Vladimir. It's always great to see you. Please stay safe. Mr. Bild, please, the floor is yours.
Well, I agree very much with what Mikola said, that there are lots of competent people in Russia. There is, in my opinion, a sort of liberal technocratic elite in the country. That is impressive, an economic tradition, a reform tradition. We saw that there were years when we saw a lot of that, which was very impressive. Then politics have turned the worst in the authoritarian, in the revisionist, in the confrontational direction for all sorts of reasons. But once we are over this particular stage, and there will be a time after this time, when this regime really reaches its end, we would certainly hope that the policies of Russia will turn away from the authoritarian, away from the revisionist path. And then I think the prospects for cooperation between Russia and the European Union are really quite great. Russia has a lot to contribute to Europe, to the European Union, and hopefully we have, Vladimir, something to contribute to the development of Russia also when these dark days are behind us.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bill. Definitely agree that Putin's regime has its expiration date and Russia has a lot to offer. It's a very talented, very good country. I really miss it and love it very much. Mr. Zurinda, thank you so much for hosting that event. Please, your concluding remarks.
Well, I am pretty sure, as Roland Freudenstein has expressed a minute ago, that plurality will win in Russia at the end of the day. Why? Because the people's movement, engagement of different NGOs are not about an ideology or party politics. This is about freedom. This is about human dignity. This is about human rights. And this is why I strongly believe that this movement can be even broader. And at the end, it is a great potential to grow and to decide at the end of the day. The sooner, the better. I thank you all. It was fantastic that we could meet. Vladimir, stay healthy, safe, and free. Carol, many thanks. And Natalia, you can now celebrate your birthday. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was very great and engaging discussion.